Keep your hands where I can see them, or I swear you're getting dropped right here. The words tore across the quiet morning like a shot, harsh and reckless, echoing off the metal pumps of the Chevron station in Elmwood. The sun had barely cleared the ridge, but its heat already pressed down on the red sand as Lieutenant Jamal Reyes stood beside his SUV, one hand still resting on the fuel pump. He turned slowly, steady, controlled, the way a man turns when he's learned that sudden movements can get you killed. Rookie Officer Tyler Voss stood 10 feet away, gun drawn, left eye twitching with a mix of fear and certainty he had invented for himself. Jamal's daughter, little Sophia, looked up from the back seat, her crayon dropping from her hand as she tried to understand why someone was yelling at her father. Jamal raised both hands, palms out, voice low and calm. "Officer, I'm complying. My daughter's in the car. Nobody here is a threat." But Voss didn't hear the words. He only saw a black Latino veteran with a Virginia plate he wrongly believed was fake, a military build he found intimidating, and a face he had already judged before the engine even cooled. His breath tightened, his voice cracked, out of the vehicle. Now, last warning, and with that, the peaceful March morning on the desert roadside collapsed into the kind of danger Jamal had prayed he would never bring near his daughter again. Before we go deeper into this story, where are you watching from? And if you want more stories told with honesty and heart, make sure you subscribe to the channel and give this video a like so it can reach more people who care about justice. Jamal stepped back from the pump, blinking once, grounding himself in the simple truth that he had survived worse. Iraq had taught him how to measure a man in one clean glance. Voss wasn't in control. He only thought he was. Jamal kept his voice low, each word placed carefully so Sophia wouldn't hear the fear beneath it. "Officer, I'm Lieutenant Jamal Reyes, United States Army. I'm traveling with my daughter. There's been a misunderstanding. I'll show you anything you need." Voss didn't wait. He didn't listen. He closed the distance in 3 fast strides, yanked the door open, and shouted so loudly the trucks idling nearby vibrated with the force of it. "Out! Out now! Step away from the child! Don't make me use force!" Sophia whimpered, seatbelt trembling against her chest. Jamal's heart pulled in 2 directions at once. He needed to protect her, but he also knew any gesture, even a gentle one, could be twisted into something dangerous by a young man carrying the ghosts of a father killed in the line of duty. Jamal stepped back, hands still raised high, and spoke with the steady tone he once used to calm frightened soldiers in the dark. "My daughter stays seated. I stay calm. We all go home safe. That's the goal here." But Voss's pulse had already decided the outcome. He grabbed the pepper spray from his belt and fired before Jamal could take another breath. The burn scorched his eyes, searing through the morning air like fire poured across glass. The world blurred. Jamal stumbled as his throat tightened, and memories from Iraq rushed in. Sandstorms swallowing the sky, warning flares in the distance, the weight of panic pressing against a man's lungs until breathing felt like betrayal. His knees hit the pavement, hands covering his face. Voss seized him by the shoulder and shoved him down, planting his knee on the side of Jamal's neck, forcing him toward the hot concrete. Jamal gasped, hands spread wide, trying to keep the world in focus, trying to show he posed no threat. He felt the pressure drive into him, cutting off the small breath he was managing to cling to. The pain was sharp, but what ripped deeper was Sophia's scream, a high crack of terror that carried across the station like a distress signal meant for anyone with a conscience. Officer Laura Kane arrived a moment later, dust swirling around her boots as she stepped out of her cruiser. She froze at what she saw. Jamal pinned, blinded, struggling to breathe, the rookie shaking with adrenaline, the child reaching toward her father with 2 trembling hands pressed against the window. Kane shouted, "Tyler, get off him! He's got a child in the car!" But Voss didn't move. His mind was somewhere else. 12 years old, at his father's funeral. hearing the whispers of officers who said the man who killed his dad looked just like this one. Kane rushed forward, grabbed Voss's vest, and ripped him backward with a force that surprised even her. Jamal inhaled sharply, chest scraping against the pavement, each breath a desperate attempt to reclaim his place in the world. Kane dropped to one knee beside him. "Sir, stay with me. I'm calling medics." Jamal nodded through the tears and the burn, trying to speak Sophia's name. A few yards away, truck driver Carlos Lobo Mendoza had already pulled out his phone. Years on the road had taught him to expect the unexpected. But this was worse than anything he'd witnessed. He hit record and let the camera tell the truth. The morning sun, the knee, the spray, the child crying for her father. He didn't step closer. He didn't interfere. He simply filmed, knowing deep in his gut that if he didn't, no one would ever believe what happened in the bright light of day. As medics arrived, everything slowed. Jamal lay on the pavement, eyelids drooping from the burn, body still shaking from the collision of PTSD and fresh trauma. Kane hovered near him, torn between duty and conscience. Voss stood speechless, the gun still in his hand, sweat rolling down the back of his neck as the weight of what he'd done began its slow descent. Sophia finally unbuckled herself, ran to Jamal, and curled into his chest, whispering over and over, "Daddy, I'm here. I'm right here." And that was how the story began. Under the harsh Arizona sun, in the middle of what should have been an ordinary morning, a veteran on the ground, a child scarred before breakfast, a rookie officer breathing hard, trying to convince himself he was still right, and a truck driver with a camera that would change everything, for Jamal, for Elmwood, and for a country already holding its breath. By the time the ambulance doors swung closed and the siren carried Jamal Reyes toward Elmwood General Hospital, the bright March morning had already curdled into a day the town would never outrun. His eyes burned from the pepper spray, and each breath scraped through his throat like sand dragged across metal. The medic spoke to him in calm, direct tones, but the room inside the ambulance felt too tight, too close, too loud. Scenes from Iraq blended with the present. A rooftop ambush, a flash of heat, comrades shouting through dust, now tangled with the image of his daughter's small face pressed to the station window, when Sophia was finally allowed to sit beside him in the hospital room. She clung to his arm and asked the same question again and again, her voice thin with fear. "Daddy, are you okay? Daddy, why did he do that?" Jamal tried to answer, but the words caught in his throat. He closed his eyes, grounding himself in the rhythm of her breathing, reminding himself that he was still here, still fighting for her. Outside that quiet moment, the world moved quickly. Carlos Lobo Mendoza uploaded the video before he even reached the state line, and by noon it spread across the Southwest like a spark dropped in dry brush. The clip wasn't long, 40 seconds of raw desert light, blinded tears, a rookie officer shouting orders he couldn't control, and a little girl screaming for her father. Yet it was enough. Enough to ignite veterans groups, civil rights advocates, and ordinary Americans who had seen too many scenes just like it. Within hours, #JusticeForReyes surged across timelines, news summaries, and veteran forums. A former Marine posted, "A man who wore the uniform deserves better." A mother from Tucson wrote, "No child should watch her father crushed under a knee." By late afternoon, the footage reached Phoenix newsrooms. Producers stopped mid-meeting when a staffer shouted, "You need to see this." They watched the scene unfold, the knee, the spray, the child's cry, and phones started ringing across the state. In his small apartment on the edge of town, Officer Tyler Voss sat on the edge of his couch, scrolling through comments that mixed fury, disbelief, and righteous anger. His own face stared back at him, sweat-soaked, jaw clenched, arm extended, frozen in a moment that no longer belonged to him. His wife, Erin, paced the kitchen, pressing a towel against her mouth to quiet the tremble in her voice. "Tyler, how could you? That was a child, a little girl. What were you thinking?" Voss rubbed his hands together, hard, as though friction could erase memory. "I gave him commands. He didn't follow. Anyone would have reacted the same way." But even as he said it, the scream from the video replayed in his mind, and the certainty he clung to wavered like heat rising from asphalt. Erin looked at him for a long moment, her eyes full of something he couldn't read, then whispered, "I don't even know who you are right now." Across town. Police Chief Robert Klein sat behind his desk, jaw clenched as he watched the footage for the 5th time. Behind him hung commendations from decades of service, most of them earned honestly, some of them covering stains he never admitted aloud. Klein had survived 3 public scandals in his career and believed he could weather a 4th. But this one felt different. The video was too clear, too public, too damning. And the man on the ground wasn't an anonymous civilian. He was a decorated Army lieutenant with no criminal record, pinned in broad daylight by a rookie who had ignored his training. Klein set the tablet down and spoke to his deputy, his voice low and deliberate. "We need to get ahead of this. Edit the body cam footage. Remove the neck pressure. If there's no knee, there's no case." The deputy hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, Chief." Klein leaned back, confident that in Elmwood, where the department had long decided what truth looked like, this would be enough. What he failed to consider was that the video from Lobo's phone had already shaped the truth for the rest of the country. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Jamal lay in a dim room with gauze covering his eyes. A doctor explained the corneal abrasions, the swelling, the bruising along his jaw and neck. But Jamal wasn't listening anymore. His mind replayed the confrontation in jagged fragments, the barked commands, the burn of the spray, the sudden force of a knee on his neck. It all merged with memories he had tried to bury for years. A rooftop in Mosul, a blast echoing across a courtyard. The moment he watched 2 men he led fall beneath gunfire. PTSD had always lurked in the edges of his life, manageable but stubborn. Now it surged to the center, suffocating him. When Sophia finally fell asleep in the chair beside him, Jamal's thoughts took a darker turn. He saw a version of himself he feared, a father who had become a burden rather than a shield. He whispered to the empty room, "Maybe she'd be safer without me." Later that evening, after he was discharged, he sat alone in his garage, engine running, hands trembling on the steering wheel. The weight of the past and present pressed on him like the knee earlier that morning. His breath grew shallow, his vision dimmed. He almost let the darkness pull him in. But a small hand slammed against the garage door window. Sophia. Her face streaked with tears, fist pounding in panic. "Daddy, please stop, please!" Her voice pulled him back from the edge, sharp and undeniable. Jamal cut the engine and stumbled out, collapsing to his knees as she wrapped her arms around him. The moment broke him open, but it also anchored him. He understood then that whatever fight was coming, he had to survive it for her sake. By nightfall, activists began organizing in Phoenix. Veteran groups issued statements demanding accountability. Journalists requested hospital access for comment. And in Elmwood's small police headquarters, tension simmered behind closed doors. Officers whispered about Voss's past, the aggression warnings from his academy instructor, the temper that surfaced in tense drills, the way Chief Klein had fast-tracked him because the department needed bodies more than discipline. The storm had only begun, but its center was already clear. A father recovering from trauma, a child who watched her world collapse in a single morning, a rookie officer hiding behind a shrinking wall of denial, and a town about to face the consequences of a truth they could no longer bury. Long before the morning that nearly took his life, Lieutenant Jamal Reyes carried memories that shaped every quiet hour he lived. At 34, he had spent more than a third of his life in uniform, serving as an army officer in Iraq, leading young soldiers through sandstorms that swallowed the sky and into villages where every doorway carried a question of life or death. He learned to read danger from the corner of his eye, to steady his breath in the dark, to speak calmly even when the earth trembled under mortar fire. The loss of men who had laughed with him hours earlier carved a permanent hollow in his chest, and that hollow ached at night when the house was quiet and his daughter slept without knowing why her father sometimes woke with sweat on his neck and silence in his voice. He had promised himself that after his divorce, after the sleepless months of trying to rebuild, he would give Sophia a life untouched by the shadows he carried. But trauma is stubborn, and it waits, tucked beneath routines and smiles, ready to rise when provoked. That was the wound he brought home from Iraq. A wound invisible until the moment a knee pressed against his neck and the desert sun blurred into the memory of another desert half a world away. At the hospital, when Sophia finally stepped out to get a snack with a nurse, Jamal closed his eyes and drifted back to the years that trained him to survive. He saw himself at 22, stepping onto the sun-blasted tarmac of an Iraqi base, sand whipping across his boots. He remembered the first time he wrote a letter to a soldier's mother after losing her son in a shootout that unfolded faster than a heartbeat. He remembered how that grief stayed with him, sitting in the corner of his conscience, reminding him to protect the men he led no matter what it cost him. Those memories followed him home after his final deployment. The marriage he tried to save collapsed under the strain, his wife saying she could not compete with nightmares she couldn't see. Jamal didn't argue. He focused on Sophia, the one part of his life untouched by war. The daughter who pulled him back into the world every morning with her bright laugh and small hand wrapped around his. He carried his pain quietly, never asking for pity, never expecting tenderness from a world that often delivered the opposite. But he worked at healing, showing up for therapy sessions every Tuesday afternoon, talking through panic triggers that surprised him, learning how to breathe when the memories tightened around his throat, while Jamal sat in that hospital room thinking back on the life that shaped him. Another story was unfolding across town, the story of the young officer who had pinned him to the ground. Tyler Voss, 24 years old, had grown up in Elmwood with a single piece of family history shaping everything that followed. When he was 12, he watched a procession of police cars wind through the town for his father's funeral. The older Voss, a patrol officer, had been killed during a robbery gone wrong. Tyler remembered standing beside the casket, staring at the flag draped across it, hearing officers whisper that the suspect who pulled the trigger was black. Nobody ever talked about the man's circumstances, or the panic that erupted in the store, or the mistakes that contributed to the tragedy. What Tyler absorbed was a single idea: that his father died at the hands of someone who looked like the man he later threw against the pavement. Over the years, that story hardened into resentment, then into fear, and finally into a quiet certainty that danger had a face. At the police academy, instructors saw flashes of that fear. His evaluations included warnings about impulse control and aggression, notes that Chief Klein later ignored because the department was short-staffed and Tyler was willing in the months leading to the incident. Voss carried his father's old badge in his glove compartment. Sometimes he touched it before starting a shift, imagining the pride his father would have felt if he could see him now. Other days, the memory grew darker. He would replay his father's funeral video late at night, watching the long line of uniformed men saluting, convincing himself that he needed to be the kind of officer who never hesitated, never questioned his instincts, But instincts built on old grief are brittle. They crack under pressure. And that morning at the Chevron, when the sun hit Jamal's license plate and Tyler misread it, every unresolved fear surged upward like a storm he couldn't control. Even now, sitting alone in his apartment, replaying the video of himself kneeling on Jamal's neck, he struggled to understand which part of him acted, the trained officer or the frightened boy who lost his father. He told himself that he reacted the way any cop would. But the sound of Sophia's scream kept pulling at him, unraveling the narrative he clung to. His mind drifted back to academy drills, to his instructor saying, "Courage is knowing the difference between fear and danger." Tyler realized he had never learned that difference. Not fully. Maybe not at all. Elsewhere in Elmwood, another life intersected with theirs. Officer Laura Kane. She had joined the department at 29, carrying a quiet determination to be better than the system she entered. She saw the cracks early, complaints dismissed, patterns ignored, force used when patience would have worked. She learned to follow the rules, to keep her head down, to survive in a place where loyalty mattered more than integrity, but she also learned to trust her instincts. And the moment she saw the rookie kneeling on Jamal's neck, her conscience cut through the silence that had kept her compliant. She was raised by a father who taught her one truth: doing nothing when wrong unfolds in front of you is as harmful as causing the wrong yourself. That morning, she grabbed Voss's vest and dragged him off Jamal without thinking of the consequences. A split-second decision that would eventually define her career and her place in the story of Elmwood's reckoning. At the center of the storm stood Chief Robert Klein, a man who had built a career on the illusion of order. He came from a generation of officers who treated misconduct as an internal matter, something handled quietly in meetings that left no paper trail. Over 25 years. He dismissed more than 36 complaints from residents of color, convinced that maintaining the department's image mattered more than addressing its flaws, in his mind. Elmwood wasn't a town struggling with racial tension. It was a place that needed firm control. He believed that protecting the badge meant shielding officers, even those unfit for the authority they carried. Klein had covered up 3 significant incidents in the past 4 years, each one involving excessive force, each one swept aside with carefully edited footage and language that softened brutality into standard procedure. What Klein didn't understand was that the structure he built was already cracking before the Chevron incident. The morning Voss dropped his knee onto Jamal's neck. The cracks spread too wide to hide. As Jamal sat in his hospital room with a nurse pressing cool cloths to his swollen eyes, he thought of the promises he had made to himself after Iraq. To be calm, to be patient, to never let fear turn him into someone Sophia wouldn't recognize. He thought of the fellow veterans who told him, "You survived war. You can survive healing." He wasn't sure he believed them then. He wasn't sure now. But he knew one truth. Survival meant facing the parts of his past he tried to bury. And survival meant fighting, not for himself, but for a future where his daughter would never again scream for help in a world that treated her father like a threat. By the next morning, the chaos around the Elmwood incident had grown into something no one in the police department could contain, and the investigation that followed began weaving together every perspective, every mistake, and every lie that had taken root long before Jamal Reyes hit the pavement at the Chevron station. The DOJ sent a preliminary inquiry team before sunrise, their arrival triggered not only by the viral video, but by the speed at which veterans organizations, civil rights lawyers, and national media demanded answers. In the sterile briefing room on the second floor of the hospital, Jamal sat with a blanket draped over his shoulders as 2 investigators asked him to recount what he remembered. His voice remained steady, but the recollection dragged him through every moment, the barked commands, the burn of the spray, the crushing knee, and the sound of Sophia crying behind glass. He paused at times to steady himself, grounding his thoughts the way his therapist had taught him. Meanwhile, Officer Laura Kane provided her first statement to Internal Affairs. Her hands trembled slightly as she accepted a glass of water, then described the scene with painful clarity. She told them she heard fear in Tyler Voss's voice, the kind that comes when a person loses control. She told them she saw the knee, saw Jamal's struggle for air, and knew instantly that something had gone terribly wrong. She spoke carefully, because every word felt like a thread tied to loyalty on one side and truth on the other. But the moment she decided to pull Voss off Reyes, her loyalty had already shifted toward what was right, across town. Tyler Voss sat in a cramped interrogation room in the Elmwood station, his uniform wrinkled, badge removed, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles blanched white. Internal Affairs played the Lobo video on a loop. Tyler stared at the screen and insisted he had followed procedure. But even he seemed unconvinced. He didn't obey commands. He said, trying to steady his voice. He reached for his pocket. The investigator paused the video, tapping the screen where Jamal's hands were raised high, palms open. Lieutenant Reyes's hands never went to his pocket. Tyler swallowed hard but still clung to his storyline, driven by instinct and fear. When they showed him the moment his knee pressed down on Jamal's neck for nearly 30 seconds, his breathing hitched. For the first time, he whispered, "I thought he was going to snap on me." Whether he meant it or hoped someone else would believe it no longer mattered. The truth was captured from 3 angles, and each angle told a version of events far different from his. While Internal Affairs conducted interviews, Chief Klein was already working behind the scenes to steer the narrative. The veteran of decades of quiet cover-ups, he leaned on the same methods that had kept the department insulated for years. He summoned his deputy chief into his office, shut the door, and gave the order with the same cold certainty he used to sign off on performance reviews. Edit Voss's body cam footage, cut the part where Reyes is on the ground, remove the knee pressure. It's an aggressive takedown, not excessive force. His deputy hesitated, but Klein's stare made the directive clear. They reviewed the footage late into the night, frame by frame, removing every second that could sink them. But what Klein didn't know was that the truth already had a life of its own, spreading across the country with the force of desert wind, and in a dusty break room nearby, Mike Harlan, Voss's former field trainer, sat listening through a cracked door. Harlan had spent a year trying to get Voss to control his impulses, warning superiors that the rookie treated every interaction like a threat. His warnings had been ignored, dismissed, buried beneath staffing shortages and Klein's belief that discipline could be taught later. But now, hearing Klein order a fabricated version of events, Harlan felt something inside him shift. He knew he couldn't stay silent. Later that afternoon, the DOJ inquiry team arrived at police headquarters with a list of force complaints from the past 4 years. What they found startled even seasoned investigators. 42 documented incidents of excessive force, 85% involving people of color, dozens of complaints dismissed without interviews, with body cam footage mysteriously corrupted or misfiled, a pattern of force far beyond what the department had reported to the state. It didn't take long for them to realize that the Reyes incident was not an anomaly. It was a symptom of a diseased culture. When they confronted Klein with the numbers, he brushed it off. "High-risk town," he said simply, as if statistics were nothing more than dust swirling in the Arizona wind. Meanwhile, something else began unfolding in the shadows, something that turned the tide even faster. A group of anonymous digital activists, outraged by the video, infiltrated Voss's personal accounts, and within hours, the world saw a different side of the rookie officer. Racist memes saved in his phone, videos of him joking crudely about minority residents, and a private recording where he mocked de-escalation training as soft. The footage wasn't deepfake, wasn't edited. It came directly from Voss's device, the metadata intact, when the first clip leaked. Voss's wife broke down sobbing in their living room, whispering, "You told me you got help. You told me you worked through this." But he had worked on nothing. He had simply buried his resentment under a crisp uniform and a thin layer of authority. When Internal Affairs questioned him about the leaked content, he tried to deny it. Then he tried to blame stress. Then he simply lowered his head, defeated. The truth weighed heavier than any excuse he could craft. Harlan arrived that same evening with the unedited body cam footage he had secretly pulled from the department's servers before Klein's team altered it. He knocked on the door of the DOJ office, handed the flash drive to the lead investigator, and said, "You need to see the real version. What they're preparing is a lie." His voice carried no anger, just a tired resignation from a man who had watched the department decline from the inside long before the public ever realized it. Back at the hospital, Jamal watched a muted version of the evening news. They were reporting on the leaks, on the patterns of force, on the growing suspicion that Elmwood PD had been hiding misconduct for years. Sophia curled beside him, holding his hand. He did not tell her what the investigation was uncovering. He did not tell her that the officer who tackled him might have viewed him as a threat before he even opened his car door. He simply squeezed her hand gently and focused on breathing. Slow, steady, deliberate. The way his therapist had taught him. Trauma had risen fast, but he was determined not to let it take him again. In the quiet of her small apartment, Laura Kane reread her own statement, knowing that her choice to intervene would come with consequences. But she also knew that silence would have cost even more. She thought about the way Jamal had struggled for air. She thought about the moment she saw humanity collapse beneath training gone wrong, and she knew that whatever came next, disciplinary hearings, backlash, ostracizing, she would face it. Because doing nothing had never been an option the moment she saw a man's life slipping away under the weight of another's fear. By nightfall, the story had transformed from a single act of violence into a sweeping investigation of a broken system. Every lie tangled with every truth, every cover-up collided with the weight of public outrage, and every person involved: Jamal, Voss, Kane, Harlan, Klein. Now stood on the edge of a reckoning none of them could escape, by the third day. The cover-up that Chief Robert Klein tried to stitch together began unraveling faster than anyone in Elmwood could contain, and what followed was a cascade of revelations that shook the town from its dusty edges to its courthouse steps. The first cracks appeared at dawn, when national reporters arrived in satellite vans and lined the street outside police headquarters. Their cameras pointed squarely at the department that had spent years operating in the shadows. Protesters gathered under the rising desert heat, holding signs that read, "Protect us, don't harm us, and veterans deserve better," calling out for accountability as chants rolled through the street like waves hitting stone, inside the hospital. Jamal watched the coverage through a haze of painkillers and exhaustion, the screen flickering as reporters dissected his life in clipped sentences: decorated veteran, single father, exemplary service record, contrasted brutally with the footage of him face down on the pavement. Every mention felt like a small tear in something private, yet he understood why it mattered. He had become a symbol long before he felt ready to carry that weight. When a journalist played the leaked audio from Voss's phone, a recording of him mocking minority residents and boasting that fear keeps them in line, Jamal's stomach tightened. He looked at Sophia, who was coloring quietly beside him, unaware of how easily the world could turn a man into an object. He wished he could shield her from it, but he also knew he couldn't hide from the truth. Not anymore. Across town, Chief Klein held an emergency meeting with his senior staff. His voice was clipped and tight as he insisted the leaks were exaggerated, insisting the department remained committed to lawful policing. But even his most loyal officers felt the shift in the room. They had seen the real footage. They had heard the real audio. They knew the department's narrative was collapsing, and Klein's authority with it. He slammed a folder shut and growled, "We protect our own. No one talks to the DOJ without my approval." But silence had already stopped being an option. The moment Harlan handed over the unedited footage the night before, the tide had turned. Investigators now had proof, not just of misconduct, but of deliberate tampering. They saw the timeline of edits, the missing seconds, the inserted static. And when they compared it to the original file Harlan preserved, the pattern of dishonesty became impossible to deny. Meanwhile, the department's intimidation tactics began in earnest. Officers visited bystanders who had been at the Chevron station, urging them to remember what they really saw. One witness, a young mechanic who had watched from behind a truck bed, later told reporters he felt pressured to say Jamal moved aggressively, but he refused, knowing the video showed otherwise. Another resident, an elderly woman who lived across from the station, received a phone call from someone claiming to be with the department, warning her that involving herself wouldn't be wise. The intimidation deepened the public distrust already spreading across Elmwood. People began recording every interaction with police. Parents kept their children inside after school. Latino families whispered about stories they once kept to themselves. Traffic stops that turned hostile without cause. Routine questions delivered with suspicion instead of courtesy. And warnings to avoid reporting misconduct because nothing ever changed. At the same time, something else shifted in the public eye. Jamal's voice. Reporters requested interviews, and though he resisted at first out of fear of breaking down, he understood the impact of speaking honestly, with Sophia beside him. He recorded a short statement from his hospital room. His voice came through soft, steady. Each pause weighted with memory. "I served this country with pride. I've lost men overseas and lived with those memories for years. But nothing prepared me for the sight of my daughter watching me pinned to the ground. I'm alive. Too many others aren't." The clip aired nationwide by evening. Veterans commented by the thousands, saying they saw themselves in him. One former soldier wrote, "The war follows you home, but no father should fight it at a gas station." Jamal received messages from men he served with in Iraq, and from strangers who had never worn a uniform but understood the fear he described. Each message grounded him, helped him steady his breathing, helped him rebuild piece by piece. Meanwhile, Voss's world continued collapsing from within. His marriage teetered under the weight of revelations. Erin confronted him that night after watching one of the leaked videos in which he laughed with another rookie about putting fear into the right people. Her voice trembled as she asked, "Is this who you really are?" Voss stared at the floor, unable to answer. The anger he carried for years, fed by grief, by a department that never challenged his biases, by a chief who rewarded aggression, now turned inward. He spent the night on the couch, overwhelmed by a guilt he wasn't ready to admit aloud. In the DOJ's temporary command office, investigators conducted interviews late into the night, reviewing decades of departmental culture. When Harlan testified, he spoke plainly. "I tried to warn them. Tyler wasn't ready to be on the street. He needed help, not a badge." He revealed pressure from Klein to minimize force complaints, described meetings where red flags were brushed aside, and recounted private conversations where Voss admitted fear every time he pulled someone over at night. One investigator later said Harlan's testimony cracked open the entire pattern. Amid the growing scrutiny, protests intensified. Hundreds gathered under the desert sun, chanting Jamal's name alongside dozens of others who had filed complaints that never saw daylight. Signs waved in the wind, drums beat steadily, people distributed water, snacks, and information about civil rights groups. A small group of veterans stood together in silence, holding photographs of men they lost overseas. One held a sign that read, "He survived Iraq to be attacked at home." The image went viral by evening, inside the hospital. Jamal's panic attacks grew sharper before they grew lighter. One afternoon, he felt a sudden tightening in his chest after hearing a medical cart clang in the hallway. The sound transported him back to a rooftop in Mosul where metal scraped against concrete moments before an ambush. He braced himself against the bed, eyes unfocused, and whispered for Sophia. She climbed into his arms without hesitation, resting her small hand on his chest until his breathing steadied. Those moments reminded him why he needed to survive the investigation, the trial, the aftermath. He wasn't just fighting for justice. He was fighting for the chance to be the father Sophia believed he was. That night, the biggest revelation reached the public. A journalist obtained documents showing that Chief Klein had personally authorized the editing of body cam footage, not only in Jamal's case, but in several earlier incidents. The report aired on primetime news, accompanied by graphics showing complaints, altered files, and internal memos. Public reaction shifted from anger to outrage in living rooms across the country. Families watched a small Arizona town become the epicenter of a national reckoning. And through it all, the people at the center of the storm, Jamal, Voss, Kane, Harlan, felt the pressure intensify with each hour. Jamal felt both exposed and empowered. Kane felt the weight of coming forward, but also a growing sense of resolve. Harlan saw the corruption he had tolerated for too long finally collapsing. And Voss, trapped between denial and remorse, began confronting the truth he had avoided all his life by the end of that long, blistering day. Elmwood was no longer a quiet desert town tucked off Interstate 10. It had become a national symbol, a place where injustice had been dragged from the shadows into the punishing light of day. And the truth, once buried by fear and loyalty, now stood uncovered for the world to judge. The federal courthouse in downtown Phoenix rose against the morning sky like a monument carved for days exactly like this. Days when truth, long buried, finally fought its way into the light, inside. The air was cool, steady, and tense with the quiet hum of a packed courtroom. Rows of spectators filled every bench. Veterans in pressed jackets sat shoulder to shoulder. Reporters with notebooks ready leaned forward as if the story might slip away if they blinked. At the center of it all sat Judge Elena Ramirez, her presence calm but commanding, her dark eyes measuring every face in the room with the same quiet scrutiny she once brought to corruption cases as a federal prosecutor. She tapped her gavel once, not for drama, but for focus, and said in a voice firm enough to settle the room, "Let's begin." Across from her, Jamal Reyes adjusted himself in the witness seat. He wore a clean shirt, the collar stiff, but his neck still bore faint marks that refused to fade. Sophia sat in the row behind him with a social worker, clutching a small, stuffed bear, watching her father with a seriousness far beyond her 8 years. Cameras were banned inside, but everyone knew the world was waiting outside those doors, refreshing feeds, watching updates, ready to hear how the country would judge what happened in the bright sun of an Arizona morning. The prosecution opened with the video, Lobo's raw, unedited recording, projected across a large monitor. Not a sound was made as the footage played. No one moved. Even the quiet airway hum seemed to pause. The jury watched as Jamal raised his hands, watched the spray hit his eyes, watched his body fall, watched the knee, watched Sophia's tiny hands pressed against the window, her scream muffled but unmistakable. And in that silence, something changed. The courtroom became not just a chamber of law, but a witness to the moment where justice had first been denied. when the video ended. The prosecutor stepped aside and let the still image linger. Jamal pinned, face to pavement, sunlight flaring off the hood of his SUV like an accusation, when it was time for Jamal to testify. He rose slowly, each movement measured. He took a breath, looked at the jury, and began. His voice did not tremble. "I have served my country for 12 years, he said, pacing his words like he was steadying a march across shifting ground. "I've led men through firefights. I've held soldiers as they took their last breaths. But nothing prepared me for the moment my daughter watched me struggle to breathe. Every pause carried weight. Not theatrical weight, human weight." He described the stop, the commands, the spray, the knee. He described the panic that surged when memories of Iraq collided with the present. And he described the moment he heard Sophia cry, the moment he realized he might die with his child watching. When he finished, the courtroom held its breath. Even Judge Ramirez gave a small, nearly imperceptible nod, acknowledging not the emotion but the clarity with which it was delivered. Then came Tyler Voss. The rookie walked to the stand with a stiff gait, eyes darting between the judge, the jury, and the defense table. The defense attorney tried to frame Voss as a young officer overwhelmed by a tense situation, shaped by a father's death and a department that failed him, but when the prosecutor stood for cross-examination, the tone shifted sharply. "Officer Voss, at what point in this video did Lieutenant Reyes resist?" Voss swallowed, eyes on the monitor. He didn't raise his hands fast enough. He muttered, "And you believe that justified pepper spray at point-blank range?" Voss hesitated, the silence loud. "I believed he was a threat, even though he identified himself as military." "People lie," Voss replied quietly. "Did the child lie? The one screaming for her father?" Voss lowered his head. The prosecutor stepped closer, voice controlled. "Officer, is this your voice in the recording from your phone?" They played the hacked audio. Voss's voice, joking, mocking, belittling de-escalation, filled the courtroom. The rookie seemed to shrink beneath it, his wife weeping softly in the spectator section. "Is this the mindset you brought into that stop?" Voss couldn't answer. His silence was its own confession, but the most devastating testimony came from someone who hadn't been expected to speak. When the prosecution called Mike Harlan, the former field trainer, a ripple moved through the room. Harlan walked to the stand with the posture of a man carrying years of regret. He spoke plainly. "I warned them," he said. "I reported Voss's aggression. I recommended more training. I told Chief Klein he wasn't ready for solo patrol." The prosecutor handed him the unedited body cam footage. "Is this the version you submitted?" "Yes." "Is this the version the department attempted to enter into evidence?" "No. They altered it." A stir moved through the courtroom. Harlan continued, steady as steel. "This wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern, a culture. And it's why Lieutenant Reyes ended up on the ground." His words cut deeper than anger could have. They exposed not only Voss, but the quiet rot that had hollowed Elmwood PD from within. When closing arguments began, the prosecution focused on accountability. "This case isn't about fear," the attorney said. "It's about responsibility. It's about truth. It's about a man who served this country being treated like a criminal without cause. And it's about a child who watched justice fail in front of her." The defense urged leniency, insisting Voss was a product of flawed training and generational trauma. But the jury saw through it. After deliberating for 7.5 hours, they returned with a unanimous verdict, guilty of aggravated assault under color of authority. The civil verdict that followed awarded $8 million to Jamal Reyes, a sum that felt heavy not for its number, but for what it acknowledged: harm done, trauma inflicted, dignity violated. When Judge Ramirez delivered sentencing, she spoke in a tone balanced between justice and reflection. Mr. Voss, fear cannot be the weapon you carry into every encounter. Authority is not armor for recklessness. You misused both, and a man almost lost his life because of it. She imposed an 18-month sentence, short in the eyes of some, long in the eyes of others, but symbolic in the narrative of accountability, before adjourning. She addressed Jamal, Lieutenant Reyes. Your service to this country does not end today. It continues in the light you bring to this room, outside the courthouse. The sun dipped low behind Phoenix's skyline as dozens of veterans stood waiting for Jamal to emerge. He walked out slowly, Sophia holding his hand, and the crowd parted for him with a reverence that felt almost sacred. When he reached the steps, he paused, breathed in the warm evening air, and understood something he had not felt since that morning in Elmwood, the beginning of restoration. The legal battle was over. The reckoning had begun. The months after the verdict reshaped Elmwood, Phoenix, and Jamal's life with a force as steady as desert wind, slow at first, then sweeping, undeniable, and permanent. Tyler Voss reported to federal custody in mid-June, carrying a small duffel bag and the hollow look of a man finally confronting the cost of choices he once justified as instinct. His sentence of 18 months did not erase what happened, but it marked a line in the sand that Elmwood's residents had never seen drawn before: accountability for an officer who misused his badge. The first days in prison stripped Voss of the authority he once clung to. He found himself alone at a metal table, replaying the morning at the Chevron station in his mind. This time without excuses to shield him, in the privacy of his cell. He whispered his father's name into the darkness, not as a shield, but as a plea for forgiveness he knew he didn't deserve. Meanwhile, Chief Robert Klein fell just as swiftly. After documents confirmed, he ordered multiple video alterations. He was removed from his position, indicted on charges including evidence tampering and civil rights obstruction. Elmwood's City Council, under national pressure, issued a formal apology to Jamal and acknowledged decades of failed oversight. Klein, once the most powerful man in the department, now sat in courtrooms as a defendant, his legacy reduced to a list of grievances and a culture he allowed to rot for years. But the true transformation unfolded in the community. The Department of Justice announced a 6-year consent decree over Elmwood PD, a sweeping mandate that required new training protocols, external oversight, civilian review boards, and body cameras with strict chain-of-custody protections. Officers would undergo mandatory bias training each quarter. Use of force reports would be reviewed by federal monitors. Early warning systems, long ignored, would flag aggressive officers before they caused harm within the first year. Use of force incidents dropped 58%. Complaints were investigated instead of buried, and residents, once conditioned to avoid the station entirely, began stepping into public meetings and speaking openly, naming experiences they had kept quiet for years. Through all of this, Jamal Reyes walked a path that was both painful and restorative. After the trial, he spent weeks rebuilding the rhythms of daily life with Sophia. They moved back into their small home near the base of the mountains, where morning light filtered through the curtains in soft gold instead of the harsh glare of body cam footage. Physical therapy eased the tension in his neck, but the deeper wounds, the memories, the panic, the guilt, healed on a slower timetable. For months, he woke from dreams of sandstorms, flashes of blue and red lights, Sophia's scream echoing across desert pavement. Therapy sessions became part of his weekly routine, not as a sign of weakness, but as an act of survival. Each step forward was quiet, deliberate, and earned. And Sophia, still shaken by what she witnessed, began drawing pictures of her father standing tall again, not in uniform, not in court, but simply holding her hand in the sun. Public attention shifted toward Jamal after the verdict, not as a symbol of suffering, but as a voice for change. He was invited to speak at veteran conferences, civil rights panels, and town halls across Arizona. At first, he declined each invitation, unsure if reliving the trauma would reopen wounds barely beginning to close. But after watching a televised interview with another veteran who said, "Reyes reminded me I'm not alone," he felt a duty to speak. His first public address took place at a university auditorium in Phoenix. He walked onto the stage wearing a simple shirt and jeans. No uniform, no symbols of rank. He began quietly. "I didn't think I'd be standing here," he said, "but I'm here because silence was part of what let this happen." His words were steady, paced with natural pauses that gave listeners a moment to breathe. He talked about PTSD not as a weakness, but as a reality many veterans carried silently. He talked about Sophia, about her strength, about the afternoon she knocked on the garage door and saved him from himself. And he talked about the future. Not a world without fear, but a world where fear is not used as a weapon. Out of these speeches grew something unexpected, a foundation. Jamal used part of the civil settlement to create the Reyes Fund for Veterans of Color, an organization dedicated to providing mental health support, legal advocacy, and financial assistance to veterans who faced discrimination during or after their service. The fund started small, a single office with 2 part-time staff members, but within months it gained national donations from veteran organizations, community groups, and individuals moved by Jamal's story. Jamal didn't run the daily operations. He let professionals handle the structure, but he shaped the mission, met with families, listened to stories that mirrored his own, and reminded each veteran who walked through the door that their trauma did not diminish their worth. Then came the letter, the one he never expected. It arrived in late autumn, folded neatly in a plain envelope with no return address. The handwriting was shaky but clear. It was from Voss. Jamal sat at the kitchen table and read it in silence. In the letter, Voss apologized not with excuses but with reflections from a man stripped of uniform and ego. He wrote about his father, about fear, about the years he spent confusing survival with aggression. He wrote, "I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know I see what I did now. I see it clearly." Jamal folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. He felt no rush to respond. Forgiveness, he understood, was not a switch to flip, but a long road he would walk when ready. Some days, the road felt near. Other days, it stretched miles away. But the letter no longer felt like a weight, more like a piece of truth resting where it needed to be. By the end of the year, Elmwood began to resemble a different place. Not perfect, not healed, but honest. Officers walked neighborhoods instead of cruising through them. Community meetings filled with families who once stayed silent. And the Chevron station, once the scene of violence, installed a plaque on a nearby wall quietly acknowledging the incident. A reminder of the day the town was forced to confront itself. On a quiet Sunday afternoon near the end of winter, Jamal and Sophia drove into the open desert where the sky stretched wide and the wind carried the clean scent of dust and sunlight. Sophia brought a bright red kite, its tail fluttering like a ribbon against the horizon. Jamal stood beside her, holding the string as she lifted the kite into the air. It rose gently, swaying at first, then catching steady wind until it soared high above them. Sophia laughed, the sound clear and bright. Jamal looked at her, then at the sky, and felt something shift inside him, not the absence of pain, but the presence of hope, a quiet, steady hope, the kind that fills a man's chest and reminds him that survival is not enough. Life must move forward, healing must continue, and light, even in the reddest, harshest desert, can still rise. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it moved you, Please subscribe and leave a like so more people can hear it.